We constantly guess what the future will look like, but we rarely ask how it will be funded. Let's run the numbers. Today we examine the green city. Right now, governments and developers around the world are building entirely new cities from scratch, designed to be perfectly sustainable, perfectly integrated, and perfectly efficient from day one. The promise is genuinely compelling. A city with minimal waste, minimal emissions, where every system is integrated and every resource flow is optimized before a single resident even moves in. So the question is straightforward. If green cities are supposed to represent the most efficient possible way to organize urban life, why do these projects keep running over budget and under-delivering? The answer may not be about the environment at all. It may be about how capital gets allocated when a project is too large and too politically attractive to be seriously questioned by its stakeholders. This is not a prediction. It is a conditional economic scenario built from documented patterns, and those patterns are already visible if you follow the incentive structure closely enough. Now, the first economic problem with hyperplanned green cities is straightforward. Every dollar committed to a master plan is a dollar that becomes unavailable for any alternative use. That is the concept of opportunity cost. When you lock capital into a single integrated infrastructure system, you simultaneously close off alternative investments that could have generated their own returns. In conventional urban development, cities tend to grow incrementally. Infrastructure adapts to actual demand. Mistakes get corrected gradually over time, and capital gets reallocated as economic conditions shift. But hyperplanned eco-cities skip that adaptive process entirely. They attempt to solve every problem simultaneously at the design stage, and that choice front-loads enormous financial risk onto a single decision point. Interestingly, the risk is not just that individual projects might fail. The deeper risk is that they consume so much capital that other, potentially more productive investments never get a chance to compete. So the stakes are not abstract. When a city bets its development budget on a single integrated vision, the opportunity cost is measured in schools, transit, and housing that could have been built. To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, we need to separate two concepts that are often treated as identical. One is sustainability as an ecological goal. The other is sustainability as a market strategy. Research on Masdar City found that the project interprets sustainability almost exclusively in economic terms, prioritizing market analysis over ecological studies and functioning primarily as a platform for commercializing clean tech products. In that specific case, the clean tech products became the purpose of the project. The ecology became the branding. And the incentive structure favored revenue capture over the environmental outcomes it advertised. Now, this does not mean every green city project follows that exact pattern, but it reveals a structural tendency. When the scale of investment is large enough, the project itself becomes the product. Under this assumption, the green label stops functioning as an ecological constraint on development and starts functioning as a premium pricing signal that attracts developers, investors, and political capital. So the first key distinction is this. A city can be genuinely ecologically sustainable, or it can be financially structured around sustainability as a brand. These two goals often conflict with each other. The second distinction matters even more for resource allocation. There is a fundamental difference between building green infrastructure because it solves a specific local problem and building it because it attracts political attention. Research suggests that hyperplanned eco-city projects are frequently shaped by local political and economic agendas rather than genuine ecological imperatives, creating a persistent mismatch between stated sustainability goals and actual implementation priorities. Here is the constraint. When a government commits to a single mega-scale green project, it creates a concentration of capital that crowds out incremental alternatives across the rest of the budget. That crowding out effect matters because incremental urban investments tend to adapt to real conditions faster than any master plan can. A better bus route here, a building retrofit there, each responding to actual observed demand. A master plan, by contrast, locks in assumptions about future demand, future technology, and future pricing that may already be obsolete before the first construction phase is even complete. So the causal chain begins with scale. The larger the upfront capital commitment, the less flexibility remains for mid-course correction. and the higher the total cost of getting the initial assumptions wrong. This is consistent with a broader documented pattern. Research on megaprojects found that 9 out of 10 experience cost overruns, with overruns of up to 50% in real terms being common across project types. That overrun pattern has remained remarkably constant across a 70-year period of comparable data, and it persists regardless of geography. The tendency toward cost escalation is not a fluke, it is structural. Now, the megaproject data spans many sectors, not only green cities. But the relevance is direct because green mega developments share the same structural features that tend to drive overruns everywhere large-scale planning occurs. Those common features include long planning horizons, high political visibility, irreversible upfront capital commitment, and complex interdependencies between subsystems that make partial adjustment extremely difficult once construction begins. Follow the incentive structure. A political leader who announces a green mega project receives attention and approval immediately. The cost overruns arrive years later, typically under a completely different administration. So the incentive cleanly separates the decision from its consequence. The decision makers who commit the capital are not the ones who manage the resulting overrun, and that misalignment systematically compounds financial risk. There is a second mechanism at work. Rigid master plans reduce a city's adaptive capacity. When infrastructure is fixed by initial design, it cannot respond to changes in population, technology, or economic conditions. Consider how the difference in resource allocation plays out. An adaptive city reallocates capital continuously in response to new information. A planned eco-city allocates capital once and then defends that allocation against revision. That defense creates its own costs over time. Resources get spent maintaining commitment to the original plan rather than improving actual outcomes, and institutional inertia turns sunk costs into ongoing financial obligations. The deeper economic issue is who bears the risk and how that risk is distributed. In evolutionary urban growth, risk is spread across many small decisions, many stakeholders, and many points in time. In a mega-planned green city, that risk concentrates dangerously. A single design error can cascade through every subsystem because those subsystems were designed to work together as an integrated unit, not as independent modules. Now, there is an important counterpoint here. Some categories of infrastructure genuinely require coordinated, large-scale planning. Transit networks, water systems, and power grids benefit from integration because fragmented provision creates its own form of inefficiency. The question is not whether planning has value, it clearly does. The question is whether the scale of the planning matches the actual scale of the coordination problem that needs to be solved. A limitation of this analysis is that it applies most clearly to showcase mega projects built in single phases on undeveloped land. Not all green urban planning operates at that scale or rigidity. Cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam have achieved significant sustainability gains through incremental policy changes, cycling infrastructure expansion, and building code reform rather than constructing entire new districts from empty ground. That incremental approach works in those cases because it preserves optionality. Each investment can be independently evaluated, adjusted, or reversed without jeopardizing the entire system. The operating assumption is that uncertainty is permanent. However, there are conditions where the incremental approach may not be sufficient. When a city faces severe legacy pollution or catastrophic flooding risk, a larger coordinated intervention may be the only viable response. So the mechanism does not argue against green planning. It argues that the economic cost of rigidity increases with the scope of the plan, and that cost deserves the same scrutiny as the benefit. So here is the resolution to the opening question. Green cities are not the economic slam dunk we expect because efficiency in a planning brochure and efficiency in practice require fundamentally different conditions to succeed. Brochure efficiency assumes fixed costs, stable demand, and predictable technology trajectories. Real economic efficiency requires the capacity to adapt when any one of those assumptions breaks down under real conditions. The opportunity cost mechanism explains why. When you concentrate capital in a rigid system, you lose the capacity to respond to surprises, and the history of urban economics is mostly a history of surprises. The political incentive mechanism explains who benefits and who bears the cost. Decision makers capture the announcement value upfront. Residents and taxpayers absorb the long-term consequences when initial assumptions prove wrong. And the rigidity mechanism explains what goes wrong operationally. Systems designed as closed integrated units cannot be partially reformed once built. They either work exactly as designed or they become very expensive mistakes. The conditional answer is this. Green cities could work economically, but only if they are designed with modularity, staged investment schedules, and built-in mechanisms that allow planners to change course as conditions evolve. The moment a green city treats its plan as permanent rather than provisional, it sacrifices the very adaptability that makes economic systems resilient across decades of changing conditions. Change the assumption, change the equilibrium. If green megaprojects were funded in careful stages, evaluated against realistic alternatives, and structured for revision, the economic outcome could look very different. But under current institutional conditions, where political incentives favor grand announcements and capital flows toward concentrated showcases, the economic inefficiency is effectively baked into the structure of how these projects get funded. So if you encounter a proposal for a new green megacity, the first question to ask is not whether the project is environmentally admirable. Ask what alternatives that capital could fund instead. Ask whether the plan can be revised mid-course. If the design cannot accommodate revision, then every dollar committed is a dollar that can never be redirected, regardless of what economic conditions change. Ask who captures the announcement value and who absorbs the financial cost when the original assumptions change. In most green megaprojects, those are fundamentally different groups of stakeholders. Ask whether those same environmental goals could be achieved with smaller, staged interventions that preserve the ability to change direction as population patterns and energy technologies evolve. It comes down to scarcity. Capital is finite, and every allocation decision is simultaneously a rejection of alternatives that remain invisible until the budget has already been spent. The goal is not to argue against sustainability. Sustainability is a legitimate constraint. The goal is to argue that economic structure matters as much as environmental intention. Separate technical feasibility from economic sustainability. A city can be technically green and economically fragile at the same time, and that fragility has real consequences for the people who live there. The funding model decides what survives, and any funding model that cannot adapt to new information is a model that has already priced in the cost of its own failure. Every city is a bet on what its residents will need tomorrow. The structure of that bet determines whether it can adapt or only endure. The future is just incentives at scale. See you tomorrow.